About the neocon?
Start right now? Okay. All right. I've just been given the high sign. Welcome, everyone. My name is Mark Moore, and I'm Program Associate in the Asia Program of the Wilson Center. And I want to welcome you today for our event on Taiwan. Just bear with me a moment, because before we start, I'd like just to make a reference to Hala Esfandiari, the Middle East program, who was a dual Iranian-American citizen and was visiting her 93-year-old mother last December when she was prevented from leaving Tehran, put under house arrest, and last month arrested and sent to prison. And then a week or two ago, she was charged with espionage against Iran, and that's a capital offense. So we're all very concerned here. And she is an internationally regarded and leading scholar on Middle East affairs, has always been an advocate for increased dialogue. That's the irony of it all. She spent most of her life arguing for dialogue. Obviously, the regime does not agree. And we have two websites that you might want to check out if you're at all interested or know Hala or attended any of her programs. The Wilson Center website is www.wilsoncenter.org, and freehala.org. That's FREEHALEH. And on the website, there are, I think, sites where you could, forward your name to call on the Iranian authorities, the government, to release her. She's 67, and I don't know if this is a direct parallel, but I see a lot of people well informed on China, and even those of us like me with no hair or gray hair at least studied about the China hands in the 50s, whose only real sin was predicting that Mao would win the Chinese Revolution, and their careers were destroyed. A lot of them had to leave the country. I know one of them set up a furniture factory in Peru to survive, and the charges were all ridiculous. And, to pick on someone who works at a think tank. I think they've also charged the Wilson Center with being a CIA headquarters, so welcome to the headquarters. But, it's really pretty bad, especially as somebody I've only been here 18 months, and I didn't know Hala that well, but certainly enough to say hello to her in the hall, and she was very animated and did a lot of work on a lot of seminars on women in the Middle East, and just a really nice, decent person. Should never happen. But anyway, so that's that. So if you can, check out the websites. But today we're here to talk about Taiwan, and I personally worked on the 1982 communique when I was in the State Department. And if there's one thing I would never have predicted, it's that in 2001, Taiwan would be offered an arms sales package, which included submarines, and as they say in Chinese, afterwards, "Mei sure," nothing happened. And so we're here to try to probe why. We have four extremely qualified speakers, and note I'm not one of them, so they are qualified, very qualified. Thomas J. Bickford, to my far right, will lead off. He's Senior Research Analyst at the CNA Corporation. Prior to that, he was an Associate Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh, where he taught international relations and Chinese politics. The subject of his presentation will be How Much is Enough? Assessing Taiwan's Defense. After that, it'll be followed by Elizabeth Haig, who's a research analyst focusing on China issues at the RAND Corporation. Before RAND, she worked at the Department of Defense, focusing on Chinese and cross-strait strategic issues. To my immediate left is Professor Vincent Wei-Chung Wang from the University of Richmond. Not only does he speak here occasionally on Taiwan issues, so some of you know him very well, but he's published over 50 scholarly articles and books, chapters on Taiwan's foreign policy. Oh, the title of Elizabeth's presentation is Taiwan's National Security, Taiwan's National Security Decision-Making System and the Defense Budget. So stay awake for that, because it's really very good. And you'll really have to pay attention to Dr. Wang's presentation, because it gets very scholarly. It's electoral/identity politics and the national security debate in Taiwan. If you survive that, Shirley Gahn, to my far left, is at the CRS and will analyze congressional reaction and congressional mood toward Taiwan these days, particularly with regard to security interests. And so then without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Tom.
Well, thank you, Mark. I'd like to thank you and the Woodrow Wilson Institute for giving me the opportunity to speak today. I'm going to try and be brief, which is unusual for me. But I figure if the longer I speak about weapon systems, the more people's eyes will glaze over, or in the case of certain people in the audience, you'll start telling me all the things I've got wrong. So we'll keep it nice and general. I think my task is to assess Taiwan's defense needs, and I think in general they're fairly clear and obvious. The problem is in what the other speakers are going to address, which is how do you go about actually getting the weapon systems you need, and so forth. I'm going to begin by looking at defining defense needs in terms of two key factors, Taiwan's geography and the nature of the opponent, the PLA. I'm then going to talk in very general terms about what this implies in terms of what Taiwan needs to obtain. And then finally, I'm going to briefly go over my assessment of the current arms package, assuming it ever gets passed. And that's probably where the naval people in the audience will start objecting. But that's fine, because I encourage debate. All right. First of all, I'd like to, I think the two key factors, if you're going to assess what Taiwan really needs, comes first by looking into the nature of the potential opponent, the People's Liberation Army, and second, geography. Let me address the PLA first. The PLA is about halfway through a long-term modernization program that began in the early 1990s. It has got a long way to go, but it is a very impressive modernization and has very strong implications not only for Taiwan's defense now, but for the foreseeable future. The PLA's modernization is going along a broad front, and it has basically three components to it. One is the PLA is acquiring a whole range of new equipment for the Air Force, the PLA Navy, and the ground forces. Second, there is a rethinking of the operational art, that is doctrine, strategy, how they intend to fight a future war. And third, all the things that support the first two, that is professional military education, training, recruiting better qualified officers, and so forth. And what I think is most impressive about PLA modernization is the holistic approach. That is, they're not just simply acquiring weapons, they're looking at all the packages, all the things that they need to look at that goes along with creating a 21st century army. That is really key. So for those of you who've had a chance to look at the DoD report that just came out, there's a very impressive list just to give you some idea of the kinds of weapon systems the PLA is acquiring. For example, the PLA Navy has acquired more Kilo-class submarines from Russia, greatly improving their capabilities. They have indigenous programs such as the Shang-class or Type 93 nuclear attack submarine, the Jin-class ballistic missile submarine. They have new aircraft such as the Su-27s, the Su-30s. They have an indigenous fighter, the J-10. They have new surface ships such as the Luzhou class. They have just demonstrated the ability to knock down satellites, only the third country in the world. So it's a very impressive range of new weapon systems they've introduced. There are more new weapon systems coming online. That alone represents a significant improvement in capability, both in terms of what these weapons can achieve and in terms of their ability to take the conflict to Taiwan. I think everybody by this point, if you have paid attention to this issue at all, is well aware that Taiwan is exposed to Chinese ballistic missiles, but less well known, for example, is the new S-300 SAM system, which has a capability of reaching some of airspace over Taiwan. But I think more important than that is, in addition, since the early 1990s, there has been considerable thinking within the PLA about what modern warfare means, how to fight it, how to prepare for it, what kind of weapon systems they have. That, I think, is equally important. I mean, in other words, one of the things I want to sort of stress in my presentation is not to focus simply on hardware, but software issues. I think those are really important. And I have my little prop today, the English version of The Science of Military Strategy, giving an example of some of the things that's coming out in the PLA. In other words, the PLA is thinking really hard and careful about how to use new kinds of weapon systems, how to integrate information technology, a digital battlefield, the whole package, along with these new weapon systems that they're acquiring. Third, and perhaps most important, I think, is the institutional infrastructure to support all of this. The PLA is undergoing a serious reform of professional military education, integrating military education with the civilian universities to acquire better quality, better qualified, better educated officer corps. They have an ambitious program to create a professional NCO corps. They have new regulations to introduce more realistic training. They are taking seriously the training for joint operations, which is exactly the kinds of operations they'll need to do to take on Taiwan. And I think that's significant because what truly makes the PLA a more capable military force is not the equipment. Lots of militaries buy fancy new shiny things. It's can you use them? That really matters. That is a very crucial thing. And so it's the whole thing. It's a holistic, very carefully thought out approach. And that means that the PLA is gradually becoming more capable. And yes, it's true, as a number of analysts have stated, that the PLA is starting from a very low base. And yes, it's true that they've got a long way to go, and it's not clear that all these reforms will be as effective as the PLA hopes. But nevertheless, the PLA is becoming increasingly more capable. And one of the points that I think this is really important is one of the standard assumptions in all debates about the Taiwanese military versus the PLA is its quantity versus quality. Taiwan is the technological, David to the PLA Goliath, and that is increasingly becoming a myth. And if the PLA is at all successful in its reforms, the eventual outcome will be a PLA that is both quantitatively stronger than the Taiwan military, but is also qualitatively the equal, or possibly even stronger. And just as sort of in passing, one of the things, and I think some of the other speakers will probably address this in more detail, is over the last several years, the Taiwan defense budget has been on decline in real terms. And this means that not just that the Taiwan military is not spending enough on new weapons or spare parts or ammunition, that also means that the Taiwan military is not spending enough on training and other issues, and that is eroding the quality of the software, the people, as well as the military equipment. And that, whereas the PLA, on the other hand, is increasing its effort in a coordinated way and has the resources to keep on doing it. And that situation really has to change if the Taiwan military is to keep pace with the PLA. I think that's a very important issue. Okay. Now, the other thing I want to stress in terms of defining what Taiwan needs is its geography. And I just want to make a couple points. I promise I won't be like your geography teacher way back in the 6th grade or 7th grade. For those of you old enough to remember when geography was a required class, like me. I want to point out, in some ways, geography works against Taiwan and Taiwan's defense. And the biggest thing in this case is the lack of strategic depth. Taiwan is a very narrow island. There are very few places where you can put air bases. There are very few places where you can put military facilities. So that makes it easier for the PLA or any other opponent, for that matter, to target Taiwan airfields. There's only so many places where you can put crucial command and control centers. If those are destroyed, there's very little option left for the Taiwan Air Force. Right, so that means puts a real strong premium on building a military system which has survivability, and in the case of an attack from mainland China. So, for example, you need a system. You want airfields which can withstand missile and air attack from the mainland. That means strengthening bunkers, hardening of communications facilities, building in redundancy, and some form of better anti-air defense, better anti-missile defense. That's crucial. Two other factors in geography work in favor of the Taiwan military. One, yes, it is an island. Yes, Taiwan is very dependent on trade, but it is very difficult to blockade an island that size, and therefore, it's not that difficult for the Taiwan to build a military which can at least do counter-blockade activities. And the other thing about a blockade that everyone has to remember is it takes a long time. And time can work in favor of the Taiwan military in sort of opening the door to the rest of the world insisting on some kind of political solution. The other factor of geography is that Taiwan is a very difficult island to invade. There are very few places where troops can come ashore. The Taiwan Straits are notorious for bad weather. There's only certain months of the year where you could conduct an amphibious operation, and as long as the Taiwan Air Force can survive any kind of first strike by the PLA, and the Taiwans can maintain air kind of superiority, there is very little chance for the PLA to get enough troops on shore to really make a difference. So it's fairly easy. So in other words, what I'm saying is, given this kind of geographical constraints, the Taiwan military does not have to be capable of defeating the PLA. It has to be capable of preventing the PLA from achieving its objectives. That is just enough to make a blockade from being secure, preventing a landing that can have a secure base, and making sure that you counter strategic death by having the ability to survive, especially command, control, and air assets. Right. So those are the kind of things that kind of really define what the room for Taiwan is. They have to counter the fact that the PLA is getting more and more capable. They have to assume that the quality as well as the quantity of the PLA will continue to improve, and they have to sort of guarantee the survivability when they lack strategic depth. They have to be able to prevent an effective blockade and effective landing forces. That's their sort of goals. Okay. Given those things, I think in general, that gives a fairly clear list of things that Taiwan needs to do. Hardening of command, communication, intelligence, radar facilities, things like this, making sure they're survivable, making sure they're redundant. The Taiwan military has indeed already done some of this stuff, but there is still room for improvement. And I want to stress, by the way, these are things that are actually not that expensive in terms of defense spending. They clearly need more SASW. I mean, for years now, the sort of analysts have criticized the Taiwan military for not having enough ASW. This is an extremely pressing need. Submarine warfare is one of the strengths of the PLA Navy. It is essential as part of anti-blockade activity to have effective ASW. You need other counter-blockade, which means some sort of surface capability, anti-mine capability. You need a lot of anti-landing abilities. And that means some of these are very simple and very cheap, such as mines, so you can mine areas where the PLA is capable of landing. Helicopters and other means to rapidly transport troops for rapid reaction in case of airdrops or small commando operations. You also need software issues, and again, I want to raise this. Just as the PLA is working very hard on improving the quality of its personnel, Taiwan needs to put more effort into this. One of the things I think is quite striking when you look at Taiwan is its lack of strategic coherence in planning. Training issues are another matter. People often note that the PLA is not very good at joint operations, but the same is also true of Taiwan. And they need to do more work on that. And just to give you a quick example, it was in the press today, Taiwan does have pilots who are trained in F-16s here in the United States. But it's just today that they're opening up a base, or announced the opening up of a base, where the pilots returning from the U.S. can pass that knowledge on to other Taiwan pilots. And I really want to kind of stress this issue of training is important, because in some ways militaries are knowledge institutions. Training and military education are ways of passing on skills and making sure skills get passed on to next generations. And it's really crucial that these be paid attention to. In addition to these issues, there's a couple of other things that are facing the Taiwan military when it comes to defense needs. One, because of budget cuts, there's an awful lot of equipment that needs to be replaced either now or within the next 10 years. Any kind of new weapon system brought in is going to cost money. Second, the the Taiwan military, that was not no political faux pas, sorry. The Taiwan military is moving away from conscription. I believe starting July, conscription period is going to be down to 14 months, and as of January, it's going to be down to 12 months, which means they're going to rely more and more on long-term service personnel. If you want to maintain quality, that means more money for recruitment, more money for retention. You need those experienced NCOs. You need those experienced officers. If you need technical personnel to run your new equipment, and I as a computer programmer can make more money in Shanghai than serving in the Taiwan military, I'm going to go to Shanghai. That's also going to cost money. And one of the problems when you sort of look at the budget is Taiwan is really going to have more things coming up that cost money than it really has a budget for. And that's why I said some kind of clear-cut strategy is going to be really essential. Some sort of political consensus, and here I defer to other members of the committee on this, some sort of consensus about where our priorities are, what to require, when, where, and so forth. That's going to be an increasingly pressing problem. They're going to have a lot of personnel costs coming up and a lot of replacement costs, in addition to what they need to buy now. All right. Finally, let me just quickly go through the current arms package. And let's see if I'm understanding things correctly. The current session ends on the 15th of this month, and then they break for the summer, and then we have an election coming up, so there's a very strong possibility the defense budget for this year will not be passed before the election. The current budget has now reduced the three main weapon systems, which we've been talking about since 2001, to I think it's $6 million for a feasibility study for the subs. So let me start with that one first. So we're looking at possibly 3 years of feasibility studies, assuming the budget gets passed, then an option to buy the subs. It'll take time to build the subs. So we're talking about somewhere between, and maybe the Admiral will correct me on this, 2015 before we get the first sub, roughly, give or take a year. At which point, they're going to be way, way behind where the PLA will be. And that raises a real issue. There's a very strong need for the subs. People in Taiwan complain about the price tag, but subs are an excellent weapon for both for ASW and for counter-blockade, so there's a very clear case for them. One thing I want to raise is that at this point, since they've been left so long and it's now beginning to look more and more like they'll never be actually approved, maybe it's time to start thinking about an alternative. But whatever Taiwan chooses to do, it does need some kinds of weapon system that can be used to counter the PLA submarine force and anti-blockade. Submarine is one method. If they choose to do something else because they left it for so long or there's no political will, that's fine, but they do need something. Another part of the package is the P-3 Orions. One of the sort of counter-arguments against this is that it's going to be very expensive. The production line has been closed down, so it's going to cost a lot more to reopen the production line to start producing these things, or it's going to cost a lot to refurbish them. Some people in Taiwan are now arguing that at this late date, maybe it might make more sense to wait and buy the successor to the P-3s, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is called its abbreviation is the MMA. Is that right? Yeah. Right. Thank you. I'm an expert on the Chinese military, not the U.S. military. Maybe, maybe not. Given how long this arms package has been lingering around, it looks like if they buy the P-3 Orions, they will be arriving to the Taiwan military about the same time the MMA will be available. Either way, it is absolutely and utterly crucial that the Taiwan military acquire some kind of improved ASW aircraft. The current aircraft that they have on ASW patrols are over 40 years old and lacking a lot of equipment that Taiwan military needs to counter the much improved Chinese submarines. For missile defense, a lot of what I hear in the public debate is why, some people criticize why buy the PAC-3s, because we'll never be able to afford enough of them. And it's true. One of the easiest ways to get around a missile defense is simply buy more missiles. And in this case, it is very easy for Beijing simply to acquire enough missiles to overwhelm any kind of defense. That is correct. However, I would argue, and people in the audience are perfectly open to disagree with me on this point, that some kind of missile defense system makes sense because the point is not so much is to intercept every single missile, but it is to get rid of enough of them so that the ones that do land cannot do enough damage. In other words, you think about missile defense as a kind of package. Some of those missiles will never reach their target. Some of those missiles will be intercepted. The rest that land will not be as effective because if Taiwan does its spending right, there will be enough hardening, enough redundancy, the ability to repair, that Taiwan will be able to recover. Right? If they don't do that, then they really are at risk, because then it leaves the door open to, in the most extreme case, the PLA being able to knock out most of their communication, coordination, and intelligence, and a significant part of the Air Force. At that point, they have a real problem. Okay, and with that, I'll pass it on to the next speaker.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much, Tom. Looks like there's a lot of opportunity for American arms sales if only Taiwan would cooperate, and the problems for cooperation will now be clarified by Elizabeth.
Okay. First of all, I would like to thank again the Wilson Center for allowing me to speak today, and also acknowledge some intellectual debt that I have to Scott Tanner on this issue, as well as some research support that I got from Matthew Sutherland today. The current struggles in Taiwan over national defense budget, and especially over its budget for large arms procurements, need to be viewed in the broader context of politics in Taiwan. Major reforms to Taiwan's national security and a much more active role for the legislative yuan over the national security decision-making system, including the Ministry of Defense. I am going to try to kind of focus not so much on the politics as on the system, and I think that you'll see why over the course of this talk. There are a lot of structural and organizational changes that are going on, and if those were not enough to complicate Taiwan's national security decision-making, the substance of the debate over the national security issues is wide-ranging, complex, and very emotional. It includes Taiwan's approach to China, its national defense strategy, how the military should be equipped and fought, and how much should be spent on defense. If viewed in the context of national security decision-making, a system that is simultaneously evolving and attempting to address difficult issues in a tumultuous political climate, it's not surprising, actually, that Taiwan's national security decision-making has encountered these obstacles in trying to coordinate its agenda with the legislative yuan and pass through major arms procurement from the United States. So in this talk, I'm going to talk first about Taiwan's national security decision-making, major substantive issues under the debate, and just briefly touch on the political context because it just can't be ignored. After laying this groundwork, I'll talk a little bit more about how Taiwan's defense budget has fallen prey to these problems in Taiwan's national security decision-making and some of the broader substantive debates in Taiwan. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about challenges in Taiwan's national security decision-making system. To a very large degree, the politics of Taiwan's dilemma over how to best maintain and revitalize its defensive and deterrent capabilities is still being shaped. And it's going to continue to be shaped by its decades-long struggle to kind of reconstruct its system for national security decision-making. It has successfully consolidated its transition to democracy, but there are still some residual tensions in its decision-making process from its earlier history of a one-party presidential authoritarian state and the military autonomy under the leadership of the Kuomintang. So this is kind of, I think that it's important to view Taiwan's system as one that's really evolving and very recently evolving. A lot of the laws that have been passed for its evolutions have been passed in the last 7 years. So this is a very important point to keep in mind. In contrast, as many of you are aware, the legislative yuan in the years of the KMT was in power was very dependable about improving military budgets, in contrast to now. Decision-making regarding procurement was very secretive. the KMT spent a lot on its military, whereas in those years, the DPP, which was then powerless, basically de-emphasized military spending in favor of social programs. There wasn't really an issue of approving the budget for dozens of F-16s. By contrast, now the weaknesses of the constitutional system as a vehicle for developing a strong foreign policy and national security consensus became dramatically apparent with the democratization, the advent of a divided government under Chen Shui-bian's presidency, and the KMT's dominance of the legislative yuan. And another issue is the actual parties themselves. The DPP was historically forged from a diverse coalition of former opposition movements. And so it's been able to provide the same kind of behind-the-scenes institutional unity that the KMT had in the past. And the KMT itself is also has become a lot more factionalized in recent years. So this is another thing that is unity. We need, if we're talking about unity of decision-making, these are all very important factors for understanding what's going on in Taiwan right now. The other thing is that the mixture of a semi-presidential style system with a multi-member legislative election system, the latter of which is going to be in place only, it's going to be replaced in the legislative yuan elections in December 2007. We can talk a little bit more about that. It can cause some serious obstacles to really effective national security decision-making. One of the reasons for this, let me talk first about the executive yuan. The semi-presidential system lacks strong presidential powers over the legislature, and also it, as I referred to earlier, it also lacks strong presidential powers over a unified political party to create coherence in the national security decision-making system. The premier in Taiwan is often out of the loop. It's bypassed in the military security chain of command, and its role is not very clear. Under Chen, the other issue is turnover, okay? Under Chen, the premier's role has been fleeting. The current premier, Zhang Junxiong, he's the 6th premier in 7 years. I mean, just imagine what that does to a decision-making system. And it's actually typical of most of the cabinet-level positions within the executive yuan. Both major parties in Taiwan lack strong internal decision-making on national security issues, something that I just kind of alluded to. The DPP has been historically a factionalized party. The KMT has become one. And this factionalism makes coordination between the executive yuan and the DPP and between the legislative yuan and either party much more difficult. Coordination between the two parties is even more difficult than between the parties and their counterparts who are in power, and whether it's in the executive yuan or the legislative yuan. And in fact, the existence of two other parties, two other major parties, there are even more than that, but the People's First Party and the Taiwan Solidarity Union complicate coordination across the parties even further, particularly on the defense budget, and I'm going to get back to that in a minute. Finally, on the executive yuan, very importantly, the decision-making has not gelled as an institution. As I mentioned, a lot of reforms have taken place over the last several years, but they haven't had an opportunity to gel. The reasons for this range from the absence of a well-developed staff with professional experience on national security issues to Chen's personalized decision-making style. And I think related to this, to both of these actually, is the high turnover of personnel in key positions. There have been 6 premiers, as I mentioned. There have been 4 ministers of defense since 2000, and that's just a sampling. I mean, there's been so much turnover that's even hard to keep track of who's been where, when. Okay. Now, the National Security Council in Taiwan is by law, since 2003, it's been the center of coordinating national security decision-making, but in fact, it hasn't really taken on this role yet. High turnover of the National Security Council's Secretary General is one reason for this. Another reason is that this person really hasn't been given the mandate to act as the person who articulates policy, Taiwan's security policy. And there hasn't been very much foreign policy and national security policy making that has been delegated. Instead, the president has retained a lot of personal presidential power and autonomy in his decision making. And I would argue that part of this is probably due to the fact that the system was not in place in 2000. So these are a lot of organizational challenges. I haven't even spoken about the military yet. Okay, the military is mid-course in its transformation from a into a politically neutral and civilian-led military. The military is now under the control of a civilian minister of defense, which ends the system in which formerly the chief of general staff basically led the armed forces and reported directly to the president, bypassing the minister of defense. This is a very big change. Services have a new command structure that's supposed to eliminate some of the extra layers of command, promote better cooperation between the services. Again, this is a structural change which Tom was kind of referring to. This requires a change in thinking about how the military operates. So these are some weighty issues that the security decision-making system has to deal with. How many more minutes do I have? Okay. Okay. All right. So we're trying to move towards a civilian-led military, but so far every civilian minister of defense has been former military, okay, including the one that was just, including the new one, Li Tianyu. So this is a real issue for Taiwan as well. And why is that, though? And I think, again, we're getting back to the issue of genuine civilian defense expertise in Taiwan is very, very shallow. There's not very much of it. And this is at all levels of the government, okay, including the most senior levels, also including the working levels. So trying to work on these substantive issues is very difficult. Another problem also has been cooperation between the Ministry of National Defense and other cabinet-level agencies, including sharing intelligence, coordinating policy. All of this has been very difficult. One positive development, though, for the future of national security decision-making has been the proliferation of think tanks and research institutions. A lot of these institutions can contract with parts of the government, and they have been doing so, doing research studies, putting on conferences, kind of acting as a depository for opposition parties to think through some of these policy issues, and supporting the current government as well, and maybe providing a future source of civilian expertise on security issues. So this is probably a positive development for the long term. So far, it looks like a lot of this analysis has been kind of mostly focused on strategic level issues, but there has also been some discussion of military and more kind of operational type issues as well. The most important, and I'm going to move on from the executive yuan and talk about the legislative yuan, and that is probably the most important institutional change in the national security decision-making process, and that is the assertiveness of the legislative yuan. The pan-blue legislative yuan leadership has followed the example of a lot of other new democracies, democratic legislatures, and it's used its budget leverage to secure influence on national security issues. And one of the reasons that it's had to do this is because it hasn't had these coordinating mechanisms between the legislative yuan and the executive yuan on higher level issues, strategic level issues, hasn't been very strong. And so there's been an increased motivation, I think, for the legislative yuan to try to use its budget control to leverage, to gain leverage over national security issues, because it hasn't had a lot of interaction on some of the higher level strategic issues. So this situation has resulted in extremely high levels of executive legislative disagreement, and there are structural, political, knowledge-based, and electoral reasons for this. I'm going to say the structural reason is what I just mentioned, are a few avenues for coordination of policy on national security issues. There are several executive yuan bodies now that have established legislative liaison offices, but these offices are basically in their infancy. They're not very well developed yet. Another, on the political, these are just fundamental. Okay, this is already, just imagine this as a system that is in its infancy. It's discussing very difficult issues, and on top of that, it's got some serious politically charged disagreements. I'm not going to talk too much about these, but because I think that they've been talked about a lot elsewhere. But Pan Blue and Plan Green parties just disagree bitterly on the substance of Taiwan's national security issues, especially as they regard cross-strait issues. And so this is just a really fundamental, this is a very important issue, but I'm not going to talk about it too much. Electoral politics. There have been strong incentives for individual legislators and legislative candidates to focus on local patronage politics for election rather than on national security issues. And I think this might change a little bit as as Taiwan moves in the next election, they're going to be moving towards a single vote in a single district, basically a single vote, single district system. And so that's going to change a lot of the patronage, but it's going to take time. I don't think it's going to happen overnight. Lack of expertise. Just as in the executive yuan and the legislative yuan, there also is there's not really a strong core of civilian expertise in the legislative yuan, and so this is needed for substantive discussion of defense issues. And I believe that would be more likely to be taking place right now if that expertise did exist and if there were mechanisms for it to occur. And these are not really very well developed yet in Taiwan. Okay, I'm going to talk very quickly about the substantive debate over national security issues. I've already talked about the structure. The substance of national security issues is even more arduous than that I've just discussed. At the strategic level, the debate touches on cross-strait relations, U.S. motives, government spending on military versus the economy. These are very fundamental questions for Taiwan to be talking about. Cross-strait policy also touches on questions about Taiwan's identity, mainland policy, Taiwanization, Bentuhua. The role of the U.S. in this debate is also prominent, and some argue that the United States is charging too much for the weapon systems. Others argue that the U.S. weapons are best, and others imply, they won't necessarily explicitly on the positive side argue this, but buying from the United States is good politics. And finally, there is a perception on Taiwan that I think is fairly widespread that Taiwan is facing an economic slump, and some argue that Taiwan shouldn't be spending heavily on defense. Debate is also about Taiwan's defense policy strategy, and I think Tom kind of alluded this in his discussion. This is a little bit less contentious than the strategic level questions, I think. And so in my view, if there were some kind of a system for discussing some of these issues, a very strong system for doing this, I think that some resolution could probably be reached. But there are disagreements. The current administration's defense strategy is building an effective deterrence and resolute defense, which includes a much more active and offensive component than previously. This is opposed by the opposition. And also the procurement that's related to it is opposed. Reforms in the military following its reorganization have also resulted in discussions over how the military should be equipped, how it should be trained, how it should be adapted to a revolution in military affairs, how it can cut costs, especially for personnel, and overseas and domestic procurement plans. These are big issues, okay? And through all of this discussion, the legislative yuan is playing an oversight role, even as the executive yuan and the legislative yuan's coordination remains weak, okay? All right, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about defense budget, and I think I have about 5 minutes left, but I think that's actually probably all I need for this because I'm trying to use it more as a case study, I think, than the defense budget itself is not the key, but it's the process where the debate has occurred that's really key. Well, first of all, it involves every difficult aspect of national security decision-making in Taiwan, including the difficult process issues like the legislative yuan's oversight of the Ministry of National Defense, coordination between the legislative yuan and the executive yuan, frequent turnover, Equally difficult issues related to Taiwan's defense, such as cross-strait policy, military strategy, changes in the Ministry of National Defense, the armed forces, the procurement process. All these things I've kind of mentioned earlier. Now, factional politics results in a lot less room for compromise in both the process of coordination and in the substance of the debate, both of which I've discussed above. So the debate over Taiwan's defense budget, it involves many moving parts, and Tom he did refer to this in his talk, so I'll touch on it very quickly. But one is the annual operating defense budget, and spending has decreased in Taiwan on its annual operating budget from about 2.7% in 2002 to just below 2.2% of GDP in 2006. The GDP has continued to climb, and the actual dollar amount of defense spending has continued to decline. And the Ministry of National Defense under Chen, at this point, in 2006, 2007, would like to increase the budget to 2.85 in 2007 and 3% by 2008. Now, I'm not sure if this is going to happen or not, but that's what they're planning on. Taiwan's procurement of the rest of the arms package offered by President Bush in 2001 is a very separate issue from this. Its complex chronology began in 2004, in June, when the Executive Yuan presented an arms procurement package, which included the PAC-3s, the anti-missile batteries, 8 diesel-electric submarines, and 12 PC Orion maritime patrol aircraft to the Legislative Yuan. These were for a total of $18.5 billion US to be spread out over the course of 15 years. There was also a bill that was sent to the Legislative Yuan, which was intended to lay the legal basis for passing a budget. It was repeatedly shelved in the procedural committee. It was later reduced to about $14.5 billion in 2005, and then finally to $10.3 billion later that year. It's a very long story, but finally, in June 2006, the Executive Yuan limited its proposal to a supplemental budget, which is not the special budget. Special budget no longer exists. Supplemental budget of US dollars, $192 million for the annual budget, annual defense budget. And this is the one that we have, that Tom was mentioning earlier. It's continued to stall in the procedural committee. Even after it did actually come out for a little while, it looked like it was going to, maybe going to pass, but it was blocked. But the chronology doesn't actually matter as much as the problems of coordination between the Executive Yuan and the Legislative Yuan on security issues that the budget kind of sheds light on. Okay. First, we have the politics of the relationship. The bill has repeatedly stagnated in the procedural committee, as I mentioned, and not in the defense committee, where the substance of debate over national security takes place in the Legislative Yuan. The fact that it's repeatedly stalled in the procedural committee suggests that the motives for stalling it are mostly political rather than substantive. So maybe if you had a stronger defense committee, would they have more leverage, and would they be able to, this is a question, would they be able to do something more to kind of spur on the debate? In terms of politics, the future, for future debates over Taiwan's defense budget, I think the question is whether some of these politics will be alleviated with these electoral reforms that are going to be taking place, especially since the smaller parties have less influence. And in this aspect, it's very important to note that the PFP has played a really important role in blocking the passage of the arms procurement budget. And I think that if there are 2 parties instead of 4, the impasse is more likely to be able to be bridged. But I also don't think that this is going to happen, in January of 2008. I think it's going to take some time. Second, on the substantive aspects of the debate, while the bill has been held up most frequently in the procedural committee, there's also been a lot of debate over the substantive aspects in the defense committee. And I think that that's important because, again, it involves the issue of trying to reach consensus on national security issues across parties and the Legislative and Executive Yuan. So far, attempts to reach consensus have not occurred, a lot of times because they've been politically charged. But one positive, and by the way, I have not tested this empirically, but my impression is that there has been an increase in MND testimony before the Legislative Yuan on a range of issues since this has become a more high-profile issue, which I think probably is a positive because it means that there's probably a little bit more interaction between the Ministry of National Defense on issues ranging from IQ tests in the military to capabilities of aircraft and submarine and the PLA's military capabilities. So I think that that's probably a positive. What's not clear to me is whether this debate occurs early and often enough in the planning process. And this probably would have to be done at the classified level. This would be a very important step in frequent interaction between the Executive Yuan and Legislative Yuan and their ability to forge a consensus on substantive issues. But given the problems that Taiwan's had protecting some of their classified information and also learning from similar, though not as serious, problems that we've had in the U.S. Congress, such a mechanism would require some real thinking about security measures. I have 2 minutes, so I am going to talk very quickly. I mentioned earlier think tanks and research institutions, and they haven't become directly involved in the kind of the discussion of arms procurement, but they have played a supporting role in some cases, providing some fodder for debate over military capabilities, strategies, and leading conferences to discuss things like air superiority, submarine capabilities. And individuals from both the Executive Yuan and Legislative Yuan have attended such conferences. And I think that that's kind of again, it's a positive. It's a very small step, but it's a positive. One thing I haven't mentioned in terms of the defense budget is the Executive Yuan's own internal challenges in decision making. And I do estimate that the frequent turnover of personnel in key positions has distracted from providing a strong unitary vision of what the government plans for Taiwan's security. We have some lingering questions about the Executive Yuan. What kind of support does the Ministry of National Defense receive from the rest of the administration when it submits its budget, particularly when the administration has its own competing priorities for the budget? The Ministry of National Defense does not get everything that they ask for. And to what extent do discussions about military capabilities and needs rise to the top of the national security decision-making structure? That's another big question. And how do they tie in with the administration's controversial military strategy and even more controversial cross-strait policy? I mean, these things need to tie together somehow, and how much have they been internally coordinated? These are all questions. So I'm going to skip on to my conclusions and just kind of lay out a few questions about what might make Taiwan's decision-making on defense issues smoother. I think first, a more institutionalized national security decision-making that is less politicized, less personalized, and has strong institutions for advising and coordinating policy would help. Second, and related to this, better liaison between the Executive Yuan and the Legislative Yuan on a range of issues, not just defense, but also higher level and even more contentious security issues. And third, related to developing a more institutionalized national security decision-making system, cultivating more civilian expertise on national security issues. I think that these are very, very important points. And then finally, related to the defense budget, would be a mechanism for considering improved domestic production and defense industries for arms procurement, which might alleviate some guns versus butter tensions, jobs at home, as well as increase interest in the issue and maybe in some cases lower costs, though not in all. But the most important, of course, is to have a less politically charged atmosphere. I think that over time, a lot of these changes will take place, but not immediately. And this is kind of the problem. How much time does Taiwan really have? I think fundamental differences on strategic priorities remain. Writing procurement into an annual budget, maybe that will actually help institutionalize discussion if it's done at a substantive working level. But I don't think that's a development that's likely to occur in the next couple of years. An Executive Yuan and Legislative Yuan dominated by one party might reduce tensions, but coordination will remain essential because Legislative Yuan oversight is going to remain. We're not going back to the 1990s, early 1990s. And I think also, again, mention of the new system in the legislative yuan of single district, single vote elections might reduce partisanship, the politically charged atmosphere, and less patronage at the for local interests. But again, this is going to take a lot of time, and right now, legislators are really thinking about whether they're even going to be reelected, because remember, the legislative yuan is going to be halved. So I think my last sentence is, many of the problems we've discussed today are likely to resolve themselves over time if they're tackled earnestly, and if the institutions are allowed to gel and to kind of be used. But I think that there will not be a lot of change over the next couple of years, and the problem is that the next couple of years for Taiwan could be critical. It's hard to say.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for that detailed analysis of the organizational and structural problems in the political process. I think it's, in one sense, on the one hand, it's a tribute to democracy. But on the other hand, if you have a real democracy, you can have a split executive and legislative branch, and you have gridlock. Gosh, do we ever have that here? Probably not. But, we have it now. Yes. Oh, okay. And now, okay, brace yourself. That was the institutional analysis. Now we're going to have the identity analysis. Vincent.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks to the Wilson Center for inviting me. I feel very privileged to serve on this panel with some experts to talk about a paradox, which is, of course, that the Taiwanese military had requested for many years for arms sales from the United States, and then in 2001, a trickle turned into a flood, and this robust package approved by President Bush 6 years later has still not been passed, and it has caused some considerable friction between friends, namely the United States and Taiwan, and then China was probably secretly quite pleased with all these unexpected developments. So I'm trying to provide some insights on the answers to this paradox, perhaps from the domestic politics standpoint. I want to focus on two things. One is electoral politics, the other is party politics. The paradox, of course, is that national security in most countries should be a nonpartisan or bipartisan issue. It should be an issue on which the political elites enjoy a high degree of consensus on the perception of the sources and the magnitude of the threats to their country's political system, fundamental values, and way of life, and the corresponding responses to such threats. There's also this rallying under the flag phenomenon, namely that on national security, it should be the executive branch that has the major say. For a young, vibrant, and competitive democracy like Taiwan, facing a giant neighbor who claims sovereignty over it and has never renounced the use of force against it and is growing stronger or even more menacing each day, national security should be a unifying force, a glue that will tie elites from the opposite side of the aisle. However, Taiwanese society is actually deeply divided over the issue of national identity, which is closely related to the public's preference over the final relationship between China and Taiwan. The extremely competitive nature of Taiwan's electoral politics has not narrowed that divide. If anything, successive elections only underscore that national identity is the fundamental cleavage in Taiwanese politics. This division also contributes to divergent views on Taiwan's threat perception and security needs. The wrangling over the purchase of the 2001 package is a case in point. I will first provide some basic information about Taiwan's demographics, the executive-legislative relationship, some opinion polls, and then I will talk about the similarities between the major parties on national security issues and also areas where they differ, and then I will compare them in a nice table, which I will show in a moment, and then conclude, maybe offer my cautiously optimistic scenario for the passage of this. You'll wonder, where is my source of optimism? Well, we will see. Well, to begin with the very simple ones, information from the kind that you can get from the World Factbook. To start with, Taiwan features ethnic diversity. About 70% of the Taiwanese population are the so-called Minnan, whose ancestors hail from southern Fujian province, and then 14% are Hakka. Together, Minnan and Hakka are sometimes also known as Taiwanese. And then 14% are the so-called mainlanders. This refers to people who emigrated to Taiwan from 1940s on and their children. But all these three groups are Han Chinese. So 98% of Taiwanese population are Han Chinese, and then 2% Aborigines. The major political parties in Taiwan, according to the distribution of their seats in the Legislative Yuan, as of May 2007, is as follows. 216 active seats. Some legislators have left their offices. The Pan Blue, which consists of the KMT, the PFP, and the new party. KMT has 90 seats, PFP has 21 seats, MP has no seats. So the Pan Blue controls 111 seats, or 51% of the LY seats. Pan Green, which consists of DPP, which now is the ruling party, and TSU. DPP has 83 seats, TSU has 12 seats. So together, they have 95 seats, or 44% of the LY seats. And then you have 4 independents and 6 nonpartisans for 10 seats, about 5%. So the first point is that the ruling party does not control the legislature. And the KMT, which had been in power for 55 years in Taiwan, unexpectedly lost the 2000 and 2004 presidential elections, now find the Legislative Yuan the major platform to exercise their power. So this is a point we need to remember. The executive branch, of course, I mentioned earlier that in 2000, President Chen Shui-bian came to power almost like an accidental president, because it was primarily the split of the Pan Blue, that in a three-way race that Chen, the DPP's Chen emerged victorious. And in 2004, the results were even more controversial, namely the results was decided by 0.2%, can't be more narrow than that. So consequently, the Pan Blue has never quite accepted the legitimacy of Chen Shui-bian. As I said, having lost the executive power, the Pan Blue have tried to find many ways to get back at Chen Shui-bian, and Legislative Yuan became a very important forum. The Pan Green always suspect the Pan Blue's loyalty, especially in recent years after 2005, after the passage of the anti-secession law. The Pan Blue leadership has gone on to the mainland. And the Pan Blue, of course, often suspect that the Pan Green is very reckless in cross-strait issues. Therefore, the lack of mutual trust between the Blue and the Green is a defining feature of Taiwanese politics. Both the KMT and the DPP are still learning to adjust to unfamiliar roles, namely a competent governing party and a loyal opposition. Whereas Hakka and the Aborigines are more likely to support the Pan Blue, the DPP and especially the TSU are predominantly Minnan political parties. So the political parties and the ethnic divide are highly correlated. It's not one-to-one, but highly correlated. Also, we need to pay attention to the evolving national identity. Here, I want to show my first table and chart. Here, I provide the survey results from National Zhengjin University Election Study Center. In 1992, 17% of the respondents say I'm Taiwanese. 45% say I'm both Taiwanese and Chinese. And 26% say I'm Chinese. And barely 14 years later, 44.4% say I'm Taiwanese, 44.1% say I'm both Taiwanese and Chinese, and only 6.2% say I am Chinese. So what happened is that there, in these decades of Taiwan's democratic transition and the consolidation, that the percentage of those that say that I'm Chinese has irreversibly declined. And there is a growing Taiwanese identity, or if not, dual identity. This, of course, is a result of the democratization. And I will say that the emphasis of a nation-building project, especially from a cultural standpoint, by the current DPP party. So you can see these color lines. So this is the both Taiwanese and the Chinese. Usually a very the modal category, but in recent years, I'm Taiwanese occasionally will eclipse that, but this line, I'm Chinese, has irreversibly declined. And this I will probably blow up a little bit more. Okay. Another, I think I'll just stand there. Another opinion post which you often hear about is what are Taiwanese preference about their final relationship between China and Taiwan, namely this issue about unification, independence, or the status quo. Of course, status quo is one of those most convoluted concepts. By the way, all these terms in these surveys are pretty convoluted, but I won't go into a methodological talk today. I only use their questions. I will say on the issue of unification, independence, and status quo, it's very stable. Majority of over 80% favor some kind of status quo. For example, the most recent survey, April 2007, by the Mainland Affairs Council, shows that only 2.1% of respondents favor unification as soon as possible. 12.9% say status quo now, unification later. So if you combine these two categories, about 15% of the Taiwanese voters are pro-unification. 15.5% say status quo indefinitely. 36.3% say status quo now, decision later. So about 51.8%, just genuinely want status quo. And then 15.4% say status quo now, independence later. And finally, 8.2% say independence as soon as possible. So if you add these two up, about 23.6% of Taiwanese voters are pro-independence. The upshot is that you have a fat middle, which is the status quo. However, scholar Emerson Niu in the Taiwan National Security Survey has also found a very interesting phenomenon, because he is trying to decipher what exactly the Taiwanese voters found. So he asked questions about the conditional preferences, and he finds that the Taiwanese can accept either unification or independence given the right circumstances. What do I mean by that? He found that if the questions is asked whether you will accept unification if the cost is low, namely the gap, the social, economic, political gap between Taiwan and mainland China is low, he found that over 50% of the Taiwanese say, yes, we can do that. And if independence can be achieved with very low cost, namely if the PRC does not attack or the United States will militarily protect, the Taiwanese say, yes, I can do that too. So it's really conditional. However, we need to, a lot of times Elizabeth have talked about the politics a little bit. I want to mention that despite the fact that these pan blue and pan green sometimes have very vehement disputes, they share some similarities on national security issues. And I'll point out 5. First is that all the major parties, DPP and TSU on the green side, KMT and PFP on the blue side, resist the rule by the PRC. Their differences are primarily tactical. For the pan-green, they favor policies that would distance Taiwan from the mainland and strengthen the nation's resolve to resist unification. For the pan-blue, they favor using protracted negotiations as a way to safely postpone a final resolution of the cross-strait dilemma and secure the best possible deal for Taiwan. Therefore, you can see that on this table, for the immediate goal of cross-strait relations, even though they differ on the ultimate goal, for instance, the green, I will basically characterize their preference as self-determination. In other words, the ultimate outcome between China and Taiwan has to respect the opinions of the Taiwanese people. Any change of the status quo must have the assent of the people of Taiwan. For the blue, they are in favor of a distant unification, which of course is conditional, namely China becomes more like Taiwan. So this may be the ultimate difference, but if you look at their immediate management of cross-strait relations, all are in favor of maintaining good relationship with the mainland. Okay. Expanding economic contact, increase interchanges, and so on. So there is no difference in terms of the present strategy, although they differ on the ultimate outcome. The second similarity all these parties share is that they all want to avoid provoking the PRC. It's obviously not wise to provoke the PRC. However, they differ on what constitutes provocation and what would qualify as a concrete advantage. For instance, the
Keyword Tiananmen.
Yes, we have a KMT candidate who actually talked about Tiananmen. For instance, for the DPP, the so-called Zhengming movement or rectification of name campaign is not a provocation, or the constitutional reform is not a provocation, but of course the pan-blue beg to differ. The third commonality among them is that they all emphasize the importance of maintaining good relations with the United States. Of course, the United States is the ultimate guarantor of Taiwan's security. However, it's also pretty ironic that both the blue and the green endear the United States to some extent, but also anger the United States to some extent. For example, the United States may probably favor the pan-blue's more moderate cross-strait relations. At least pan-blue have this one China policy. That's a Freudian slip. Exactly.
Excellent.
But the pan-blue also angered the United States by this consistent opposing of arms purchase, as Elizabeth mentioned. Pan-green may endear the United States because it wants the arms sale, but sometimes the pan-green is considered quite reckless on cross-strait policy. Fourth, all the major parties affirm the Republic of China's sovereignty by maintaining formal diplomatic ties with other states, even though the DPP as opposition party criticized the KMT's quote-unquote dollar diplomacy, but once it is in power, its diplomacy is pretty much the same. I think the symbolic importance of formal diplomatic allies to an internationally isolated state like Taiwan cannot be overstated. And finally, they all strive for international sympathy and strengthen substantive ties with states and non-governmental organizations. So these are the important commonalities that often were overlooked when we talk about national security. However, they also have some important differences, and this also goes to show the weaknesses of Taiwan's democracy, especially in the national security area. First of all, there is a low mutual trust between the DPP political appointees and the civil servants. Most of the civil servants were recruited and socialized by the KMT. This obviously reduced the effective governance. Second, the confrontation between the ruling DPP and the opposition pan-blue, especially after the very controversial 2004 election, and caused national security policy to become the victim of partisan confrontation. I won't say very much about this because Elizabeth has already, and Tom has already talked about this. For instance, on the arms purchase issue, we see an interesting role reversal between the KMT and the DPP, because the DPP used to be the watchdog as opposition party, but now it's a ruling party, and the KMT, interestingly enough, claim to watch the purse string for the people. So the opposition has resorted to all kinds of tactics. First, they say the cost is too high, and then they say they are not opposed to arms sale, but they want a reasonable arms sale package, and they also want to score political points against Chen Shui-bian, a president they never accepted whose legitimacy. They also say that Taiwan's security is a political issue, not a military issue. Some, whom I will call defeatists, like Li Ao, simply said that unification is inevitable. Therefore, no amount of purchase weapons can do Taiwan any good. Some think that promoting economic and cultural exchange with the PRC, not provoking the PRC, is the better defense. Therefore, there's no need to buy weapons. In fact, buying weapons may provoke the PRC. Some think that the United States will intervene regardless because of its own self-interest. So these people think that it's not a military issue. It's basically a political issue. They also try to compartmentalize the arms sales package. They say that PC Orion is less controversial, so let it go. The PAC 3, they say that it was defeated in the 2004 referendum. Therefore, it had to wait for 3 years. Well, now 3 years have elapsed. Submarines, they say that the price tag is very high. They also say that the special budget is not good. It should be allocated into annual regular budget and so on. And they also attach all kinds of conditionality. The most recent one is to tie up the entire central government's budget with the reform of Central Election Commission by partisan distribution. So this, I equate that as basically political brinksmanship. Third important weakness of Taiwanese democracy on national security is that democracy has actually expanded Taiwan's spending on social welfare at the expense of national defense budget. This is the classic gun versus butter issue in government expenditure. In 1994, defense expenditure constituted 24% of the Taiwanese government budget. 10 years later, it dropped to 15%. On the other hand, social welfare rose from 9% of government budget in 1994 to 18% in 2004. It's a lot more popular for politicians to campaign for, say, higher pensions or some subsidies than to campaign for a public good, which is defense. Elizabeth has already mentioned that defense expenditure had declined in both relative and absolute terms. In 1993, defense expenditure was $11.2 billion US dollars, or 5.7% of the GNP. And in 2002, Taiwan's defense expenditure was $7.7 billion, or 2.6% of the GNP, although President Chen promised to restore this to 3% in 2008. Fourth, it is taking some time and effort to depoliticize the military in Taiwan. Some people have concern about the morale of the Taiwanese military. Professional soldiers often ask, for what should they fight, and for whom should they fight? And finally, just like any other democracy, Taiwanese national security decision-making face a pressure group. One group in particular is worth mentioning, which is Taiwanese businessmen doing business in China, or Taishang. They obviously favor closer economic links and direct air flights and so on. However, the security implications of closer economic interdependence or dependence cannot be overlooked. For instance, the PRC has now replaced the United States and Japan as Taiwan's largest trading partner, and Taiwan's cumulative investment on the mainland is now over $100 billion. And at any given time, there's an estimated over 1 million Taiwanese work or live in the PRC. That's more than 5% of Taiwan's population. Therefore, people are concerned about the hostage effect, namely, what if the PRC use these Taiwanese investments as hostage to effect, political concession on the part of Taiwan, or the hollowing out effect, namely all Taiwan's higher value-added industries hollow out to mainland and therefore will actually contribute to Taiwan's economic recession. But some people also think that the Taiwanese businessmen have actually contributed to a so-called mellowing effect on the part of the PRC. Namely, they created vested interests, therefore it will tie China's hands when they consider using force against Taiwan. And a final weakness of the Taiwanese democracy is the hyperactive mass media. The Pan-Green complains that most of the print and electronic media have a pro-blue media. So their response was to actually cultivate their underground radios. So the media actually in Taiwan has actually, I know that the media people work very hard in Taiwan, but for the most part, it's very partisan and they generated more heat, not much light. Now, to continue this table, I talk about their management of the cross-strait relations in the short run and in the long run. And in terms of identity, the Green parties are more likely to consider themselves as Taiwanese only, or both Taiwanese and Chinese, but never Chinese. In contrast, the Blue parties are more likely to consider themselves as both Chinese and Taiwanese, or Chinese. The Greens are more likely to see Taiwan and China as two separate countries. The Blue are more likely to acknowledge that Taiwan is at least culturally and historically part of China, or accept a future one China under certain conditions, as I said, democracy, prosperity, and parity, and so on. And their views on China are also different. The Green are more likely to see China as a hostile external enemy, which is getting more and more menacing because of the rapid military modernization. The Blue have a very ambivalent attitudes about China. On the one hand, they see it as a security challenge, but it is politically manageable in that as long as Taiwan does not declare independence, there's no reason that China could use force against Taiwan. So it's politically manageable. It also sees China as an economic opportunity. They expect the people-to-people exchange and economic integration across the Taiwan Strait will reduce the mistrust and tension between the two sides and eventually lead to reconciliation. And they also differ on the views on arms buildup. The Green obviously favor arms buildup, including possibly developing offensive weapons as a deterrent against Chinese aggression and guarantee autonomy. Sorry about the typo. And the Blue oppose arms buildup on the ground that it is unnecessary to be used against compatriots, if you see Taiwanese as basically Chinese, or even provocative. Taiwan's security is a political, not a military issue. As long as Taiwan does not declare independence, China will not attack Taiwan. We have to keep these in mind to inform their different attitudes about arms package. Now, as a way of conclusion, what's going to happen to Taiwan's national security debate, and particularly this 2001 arms sale package? As I demonstrated, I hope that national identity, party politics, and divergent threat perception and security imperatives in Taiwan are intertwined, and they are exacerbated by the competitive elections. The 2001 arms sale package have caused unintended consequences, namely, as I said, the wear and tear in the relationship between the United States and Taiwan. However, I would still like to urge our American friends to let the Taiwanese democratic process work itself out. As Elizabeth and Tom mentioned, this might take time. It might take time. But of course, this is taking time against the background of China's rapid economic and military rise. I should also ask the United States to avoid using this as a litmus test about questioning Taiwan's seriousness about defending itself. According to my friends at AIT, who have worked with the Taiwanese armed forces, the Taiwanese will to fight is unquestionable. If the United States may have a diplomatic option of defending or abandoning an ally, but for these Taiwanese, it's their home, so they will fight to their death. I think Taiwan would deserve more support, so let the two friends work this thing out. I'm cautiously optimistic because I think that elections are drawing near. This is actually a counterintuitive conclusion. You may say that as the goodwill between the blue and the green is already in low supply, so as the election draws near, they may actually become even more nasty, which is true. And I really think that the standoff over the arms sale is coming to an head. And I want to invoke a Chinese word, 危机, crisis, which actually consists of two characters, danger and opportunity. The pan blue and the pan green in recent years have proved capable of coming up with some kind of solution. For example, abolishing the National Assembly, halving the legislature, and so on. So they will find a way to resolve their standoff. Some obstacles have been removed. For example, the price tag had several times reduced. The 3-year wait for the PAC-3 has also elapsed. The two parties have no disagreements over Orion. I think for the PFP and the KMT, they should refrain from adding new obstacles. For the Green, they should exercise leadership. And hopefully, on the basis of their commonalities, the 5 commonalities I just mentioned earlier, it is possible for the Taiwanese, a young democracy, to have a bipartisan, a cross-party national security strategy. Thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. And of course, we all hope for optimistic outcomes. I'm in favor of optimism. Now we've saved, for all those of you who are getting a little bit tired, Ms. Gan has sound as well as sight, so it should be easy. Correct, Cheryl? That's right. I warned you.
Okay. Bear with me, I only do one of these PowerPoints about once every 3 years. Okay. All right. So I am batting last, and I was asked to talk about some implications for the United States in my paper, which I wrote. And so let's just start here. We'll have some fun. If there was a show 24 in Taiwan, what would be the scariest threat facing Jack Bauer? Would it be this? This? Or this? Or this?
That costs you $150.
Well, you get the point. I'm reiterating some of the points that my colleagues already made. There is no consensus in Taiwan about national identity, about national security, about defense, about anything. And so if people were to point to a threat, I think we would get very different answers. In February, just in February a few months ago, there was an expectation that Taiwan's legislature would pass the defense budget for 2007 in early March. Well, here we are. It's June. Nothing has happened. Why? We've already heard a number of explanations. There have been a lot of frustrated U.S. officials and businesses who have been waiting for years for decisions on Taiwan's defense. But I think that the answer from political decision makers in Taiwan already is evident. There is no sense of urgency when it comes to Taiwan's self-defense. Why? Well, we have a dispute. They're facing different, very different futures for the people of Taiwan. We have a dispute across the Taiwan Strait. One slogan in Xiamen, the other one you can see in Jinmen. Taiwan supporters find it hard to comprehend Taiwan's lack of urgency when it comes to self-defense at a time, as Tom mentioned, when the PLA has accelerated its Taiwan-focused modernization since the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis, precisely to, quote-unquote, unify China. There is no shortage of theories. We've heard some of them already, from Taiwan is a free rider to Beijing is meddling, denial and deception, domestic politics, maybe there are genuine policy differences, domestic politics, identity politics, the economy cannot afford it. The economy has already jumped from the United States to the China bandwagon. There's even sexier theories like there's a conspiracy and sabotage within the MND. Taiwan basically lacks a consensus about security. We also have problems where people think there might be weak, inadequate, or unrealistic leadership in both sides. What I would say is that what do not explain are the facts of Taiwan's democracy or divided government. And as I mentioned about the economy, this slide shows that exports to the PRC and Hong Kong have actually been greater than that to the United States, Europe, and Japan combined. No matter what the explanation, at the end of the day, if there are national leaders in Taiwan, then they are decision makers in forging national policies, especially for national security. Defense is only one part of that, but it's an important component. And today we are here to talk about, in this panel, Taiwan's dilemma. But a dilemma is a situation in which a difficult decision has to be made. But I would argue that Taiwan is beyond facing a dilemma. Let's look at one indicator, and this is only an indicator, so don't get all into the numbers. Here is the PRC's military budget since the 95-96 Taiwan Strait crisis. Here is Taiwan's defense budget since the 95-96 Strait crisis. The number there for 2007 is only if the defense budget is passed, which it has not even been passed for 2007. Although it is now well into midway point. Last fall, I would remind everyone that the United States, both officially and in the private sector, had expected that the budget would be passed last fall in the LY session. That was considered the last critical period. The U.S. side has been waiting 2004, 2005, 2006, 2007, and now some say, like Vincent, let's wait and see. Something will happen. Something will happen now and maybe 2008. This paper argues that there already are answers for the United States in terms of our national interests from Taiwan. We can already draw some important lessons learned about the defense relationship. Earlier expectations have not been met. Greater deterrence against Beijing's aggression and maintenance of the military balance in Taipei's favor have not resulted in the policy breakthroughs begun by the Clinton administration and then carried on and expanded by the Bush administration after that crisis in the mid-1990s. The question for future decision-making for the United States is, was our policy incorrect or was the timing just wrong? In any case, the previous upward trend of initiatives for Taiwan's defense is over. Unlike the presidential campaign season of 1992, there has been no outcry for current requests from Taiwan for new F-16 fighters. Legislation in Congress to allow U.S. general and flag officers to visit Taiwan has failed in 6 attempts, involving even the influence of Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld to oppose such a change in policy by those people at the State Department. And I'm going to go on and talk about some lessons learned that I alluded to. You might also call them debunking some myths. In any case, I'm going to challenge or examine some assertions or misperceptions about the Taiwan Strait situation. First, concerning arms budgets. One assertion is that the program is too expensive, the submarine program. Well, I call it the incredible shrinking submarine program. The objection has been it's way too expensive, but as you can see, the amount of money under debate has actually gone down from as much as $12 billion to $6 million. Another assertion about the arms budget is that the lack of a special budget to buy the 3 defense items is the key, the problem. But the United States officially has mentioned to Taiwan, discussed this and tried to convey this, that we are not caught up in what budgeting mechanism Taiwan wants to use. Another set of assertions have to do with Taiwan's defense capabilities. One assertion is that Taiwan has not upgraded its defense capabilities. Taiwan's military actually has taken some important steps to improve its self-defense capabilities that need to be recognized. There are professional military commanders dedicated to their missions who have tried to carry out significant defense upgrades. In May 2003, the LY passed a budget, controversial, but they passed it, of about $800 million to buy 4 Kit-class destroyers, and they have now all been transferred to Taiwan's Navy. Then in November 2003, Taiwan's legislature also approved a request for about $800 million to fund an early warning radar, which had been previously approved by the Clinton administration under pressure from the Congress back in 1999. Again, in 1999, there was some movement by the United States to press Taiwan towards upgrades for C4ISR, and Taiwan has procured a program costing over $1 billion for C4ISR upgrade program. Another assertion, Taiwan has faced a dire missile threat. Now we're using the number of over 900 short-range ballistic missiles targeted against Taiwan. And it is a threat because the willingness to use them and the intention to use them has been clearly demonstrated. So Taiwan needs missile defense systems, right? Some people might not be aware of this because this was a long time ago. Back in the days of the Clinton administration, in 1999, Congress required the Secretary of Defense to submit a report on theater missile defense systems that could protect and be transferred to Taiwan and 2 allies, Japan and South Korea. A number of systems were discussed that could be transferred to Taiwan. However, Taiwan has actually been reluctant to procure more missile defense systems after acquiring in 1997 Patriot missile systems with PAC-2 missiles. Acquisition of missile defense systems has actually been very, very controversial with the military and politicians, not only from the Green, actually, contrary to some perceptions, but from both sides have opted for so-called offensive missiles for quote-unquote strategic deterrence. Missile defense has been politicized. The KMT has blocked purchases of the PAC-3 missile system, inciting what many Americans would say is an excuse, namely that the March 2004 referendum, quote-unquote, vetoed the proposal. Another assertion, Taiwan's military reforms are really centered on civilian control. To some people, that means a non-KMT military. I would argue that contrary to the typical rhetoric in Taiwan about military reforms that seek civilian control and a nationalized military, Taiwan's professional military officers simply need depoliticized, predictable commands and budgets to carry out their missions, which they know very well what needs to be done. Despite calls for volunteer military made of professional personnel, Taiwan has not come up with the necessary funds to fund the salaries of a dedicated professional military. You even hear misperceptions like, well, it would cost less money, right? No. Another assertion, Taiwan suffers from PRC-led marginalization in the world. Yes, the PRC does subject Taiwan to marginalization, and it is increasing. However, Taiwan itself has instilled some self-marginalization. The United States invited Defense Minister Tong Yao-ming to come in 2002. He was the first ROC defense minister to come to the United States on a non-transit purpose since 1979. But he has also been the last one to come thus far. In 2004, Taiwan's Defense Minister Li Jie actually proposed withdrawing Taiwan's F-16 fighters and pilots from Luke Air Force Base in Arizona, where they have been receiving top-rated training. And it has been mentioned previously how important that kind of training can be. Another set of assertions, stability in the Taiwan Strait. We have more knowledge and certainty about Taiwan and what it would do in another crisis, right? Well, there's actually been in this debate, we have seen some aspects of anti-Americanism appearing in Taiwan. In a crisis, if we were to have another crisis, Taiwan would actually be one of the parties that would be the wild card. Taiwan could de-escalate in a crisis, and we hope that there would be no crisis, but also de-escalation, and at least American escalation control. But it could also escalate the situation or stay paralyzed. Why? Well, we've seen what has happened in the last 6 years. Moreover, Taiwan's development of new land attack cruise missiles adds another level of concern to the Bush administration. And just in April, the Bush administration took a very rare public step to dispel a misperception that the United States supports the development of land attack cruise missiles that could target PRC targets. And that was a misperception that was seen as dangerously out of control. Another assertion, the United States is bogged down in Afghanistan and Iraq and cannot help to defend Taiwan, right? Well, the United States military has actually been monitoring the developments in the Taiwan Strait very closely, as you might imagine, not only in Washington, very closely in Honolulu, and also sometimes in Guam, where there has been a defense buildup on a U.S. territory that we control, that we do not need permission, and where the sailing time to the Western Pacific for the U.S. Navy would be 1/3 of that from Hawaii, from Pearl Harbor. There is yet another aspect for consideration about this assertion, however, an issue that has sometimes been incorrectly conveyed for political leaders of Taiwan. Not only is there a question of whether the United States has the capacity to resist the use of force or coercion against Taiwan. These are words from the Taiwan Relations Act. There's also a question of whether the United States is willing to help Taiwan defend itself. Not only the Bush administration has provided caveats, but some in Congress have also issued similar statements of caution. Just most recently, speaking to the new PACOM commander, Admiral Keating, at a hearing, Senator Warner of the Armed Services Committee warned Taiwan not to play the TRA card. Let's look at another set of assertions concerning U.S. policy. I've heard a lot of people sometimes say that, well, the United States, especially the Pentagon, has a lot of leverage over Taiwan. Well, we see how much that has worked out. The next set of assertions are together. These are ones that I particularly find need examination. One is that Congress has ignored Taiwan and has not engaged enough with Taiwan's leaders, political leaders. Another one, the United States has not given enough information about weapon systems to Taiwan's LY. Another one, the United States should stop bashing the KMT. You hear these all the time. Well, actually, members of Congress have paid a lot of attention to Taiwan's defense budgets and have appealed to both the DPP and the KMT sides. Members of Congress and Pentagon officials at the Pentagon met with a major cross-strait delegation from the LY led by Wang Jinping, who came to the United States in 2004. They gained direct information on weapon systems. The LY delegation visited Hawaii, Washington, D.C., Texas. In August 2005, the KMT gained a new chairman, Ma Ying-jeou. The Taiwan caucus in the House immediately invited Ma Ying-jeou in a letter to visit Washington and engage bilaterally, officially, with the United States Congress. But Ma Ying-jeou responded that he would be too busy. Later, he scheduled a trip to Washington in March 2006, precisely when Congress was in recess. When Ma was here, he had no details about what his defense priorities or policies or visions would be in meetings during his visit, both in the private section with the Bush administration, but even Robert Zoellick, Deputy Secretary of State, met with him. Another assertion is that the TRA is a one-way obligation of the United States to defend Taiwan. Some have asserted that the Taiwan Relations Act is a U.S. commitment to defend Taiwan, is a one-way obligation of Washington, or even a free giveaway on weapons. In September 2005, a high-level official of the Defense Department wanted to caution Taiwan against this misperception. Richard Lawless said, under the TRA, the U.S. is obligated to enable Taiwan to maintain a sufficient self-defense. But the reality is, it is Taiwan that is obligated to have a sufficient self-defense. So now what do we do? A lot of people would say, a lot of people in this town or in Taipei, so what more can be done? There are alternative approaches. I don't have any recommendations, but I would just point out that if the crisis of 1995 and 96 was a watershed in the Taiwan Strait situation, that's the way the United States views it, then Taiwan's decision to not decide on defense as a priority is another shift with implications for U.S. policy. One question often asked in Taipei is, has the relationship been harmed, and is it still repairable? A question often asked in Washington is, what more can be done? Haven't the United States done enough since the ball has stayed in Taiwan's court since 2001? There are several alternative approaches, and some have already been attempted. 7 options that I will discuss in my paper can be summarized as 1, engagement, 2, compromise, 3, warnings, 4, silence. A lot of times, the United States, the Bush administration, even the Pentagon, has declined to say anything at all. And 5, new initiatives. Related to that would be 6, a re-emphasis on cross-strait dialogue. And finally, 7, disengagement. Thank you.
I think we need some elucidation on those last 7, but that's all right. Just no time for now. Maybe later. Let me ask my crack administrative staff, Michael. Can we, since it's my fault, we've really run over, and we're being webcast. So can we cut off the webcast now and then just have Q's and A's? Huh? Oh, at 5:30 it's automatic. Okay, well, you listeners out there, you get to listen to some Q's and A's. And I have, while the panel wasn't looking, I bolted them into their seats. So we can stay a little longer. For those of you whose stomachs are not growling, we will. At 5:30, the webcast ends, but we can go on for it, because I think this very interesting presentation probably will elicit, I see very eager minds out there. So let's start the Q's and A's. Hands, please. Okay, Jacob, let's start with you. Since we are still in the webcast phase, please identify yourself, your name and your affiliation.
My name is Jacob Chen for the KMT PFP office here. I have some quick clarifications first. The first one is the LY, the parliamentary election for Taiwan will be January 12th, 08, Saturday next year, not this year. Secondly, this will be a single-member district, but 2 votes. Thirdly, Taiwan under KMT in Taiwan, not including China, has at least 3 real civilian defense ministers, which DPP has none. The fourth is that when the member of Congress invited Ma Ying-jeou to come here, he was really too busy just assuming the chairmanship in 1 month, so he had to postpone. But when he came last March, it was under clear administration invitation. This is what I can say. My question is to Mr. Bigford, will there be a real balance of military power in Taiwan Strait at all, excluding U.S.?
Excluding you.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, well, that's very simple. The answer is no.
Okay, moving on. Next question. Wait for the microphone.
Yeah, Dave Ahern with Space and Missile Defense Report. 2 points. First, is it possible that the seeming impasse in Taiwan moving ahead with an expensive purchase of weapons is just due to a recognition on the part of Taiwanese that you really need the United States to be able to offset the enormous might of China, especially since that might is growing enormously. And anything they do on their own, well, that's nice, but without the United States, nothing's going to happen. And secondly, is there possibly, on the part of the United States, an attitude by some that, okay, if we lose Taiwan, so what? I mean, if this were to happen, most of our trade relations are with China to the tune of, I think, $233 billion trade deficit last year. China is enormously more important than Taiwan economically to the United States. Therefore, if China goes ahead, okay, it gets what it wants and life continues.
Deep philosophical. Do I have any volunteers? Who are you aiming that question? Panel?
Possibly just a quick one.
All right,
okay,
yeah.
well, my
Oh, there
lucky
you
day.
We get all the easy ones.
Well, yeah, I mean, this first part, in the long run, if you're just looking at Taiwan versus mainland China, they can't win an arms race. If you're looking 20 years, 10 years down the road. Most of my remarks were sort of entered in terms of keeping some sort of balance in the very short term, but once you get beyond that, there is just no way. I mean, I don't know if Shirley can bring up the numbers again, but if you take the DoD numbers, you're talking about 10 to 1, 12 to 1, and that gap's only going to increase. So without the U.S. as a balancer, that's not it. As far as the so what factor, I guess that depends on who you ask. From a purely economic point of view, I'm not sure the U.S. loses. There are, however, some people in this town and elsewhere in the United States who, for example, would argue there's a crucial principle at stake, defense of democracy. And there are also some people who would argue that acquisition of Taiwan would enhance China's ability to dominate that part of the Pacific. And would certainly make it easier for China to deny the U.S. access from a military perspective. That is, but beyond that, I'm not really sure. We've actually really had a strong debate about the Taiwan so what.
Let me just throw my 2 cents in and just point out that it depends on the circumstances. I mean, if a crazoid president in the future of Taiwan says, we're independent, I don't care.
Yeah.
You know, then they deserve, they deserve what they get. But if for whatever reason there's, you know, the 150 million migrant laborers in China are putting pressure on, and the PRC is feeling that it's imploding, and it has to do something to raise nationalism. So a submarine blockade would be a good idea. I think that would, you know, it changes the calculus. So as usual, reflecting my State Department background, it depends on the situation. Anybody else? Vincent?
Well, I think the intangible loss would be great, because if the United States give up Taiwan, other allies will question the U.S. credibility. If a surging China can get whatever it wants, what does that say about Japan? I mean, Japan will probably want to develop its own nuclear forces. So I think that actually will have an ominous impact on the arms race in East Asia.
Yeah, that's a good point. Don't forget Japan. Admiral. Yeah, good point.
Eric McVeigh, the Institute for Foreign Policy Analysis. Tom, you kept looking at me like you wanted me to comment.
I was actually a fear that you would correct me.
Let me offer just a couple of thoughts that I would have added to round things out. When you said what was being modernized in the PLA, I certainly would have given prominence to the 2nd Artillery.
Yes.
And, you know, based on the numbers of SRBMs, as Shirley mentioned, and so forth, the accuracy. And then especially we think they're doing with MRBMs, and you can't ignore the ICBM picture, too. But right. Then with respect to submarines, to add some balance, you might want to take note that not everybody agrees that 8 diesel-electric submarines are effective in any submarine warfare. Too slow, can't cover much ground, can't get to the target. Not that they're useless, but anyway, that's that
better than
very strongly
it's better than 2
expressed
Guppy
view.
class ships.
And at Corso, very accurately you state, with what the PLA Navy is doing with its submarine force, by the time these get there, you kind of wonder. But anyway, one other thing. Of course, you know I'm a former P3 guy. I couldn't help but think what my today's colleagues would say about early in the program having a significant number of those aircraft, of the MMA aircraft, going to another country, so to speak. Didn't want to use the wrong term there. For Professor Wang, I thought you stated a little too strongly. I'm not sure whether you were agreeing with a point you said. AIT said that they would fight to the death. You know, of course, there's not universal agreement. You can hear all sorts of expressions. I'm not trying to weigh on the validity of that, but just say there are a lot of statements made one way or the other.
Okay. I think I've been favoring the left side of the audience, or my left, right there. Sui.
Analogy that that hasn't been made, so therefore let me make it, is that in a way that Taiwan could be regarded as China's Malvinas, that there is a risk that an attempt of conquest that failed would be devastating for China, and you don't really need parity. The Finns maintain their independence because the Soviets, who in theory could have conquered all of Finland, recognized that the cost was too great, and Finland was once part of Russia for over 100 years, but finally they decided that the cost was too great, and China might, in fact, all Taiwan needs is to have a first-rate force, not in anywhere near proportion to the forces opposing, that the cost of conquest might destroy the goose that is laying golden eggs around the world.
Okay, thank you. I guess that's just a comment. Okay, I think the webcast is over, so now you can say what you want. Okay, over here, Michael.
I'm Gerrit van der Wees of the Formosan Association. I'd first like to make a comment on the earlier question here. If we lose Taiwan, so what? I think 2 other reasons besides that were mentioned. Taiwan has a very strategic location. It's on the sea lanes, through which about 80% of the oil supply for Japan and Korea go. So that's an important factor. Secondly, it's an essential link in the technology chain between Silicon Valley, Taiwan, Hsinchu, and then production in China. So those are two other factors that are of importance there. My question is to Tom Bickford. In military strategy, a distinction is generally made between capabilities and intentions. You did describe the build-up of capabilities. Can you derive something from that for the intentions? In other words, does China's build-up show it has intentions to attack Taiwan?
I would say that China would prefer some kind of peaceful resolution of its differences with Taiwan. And that the primary goal is first deterrence, try to deter de jure independence. Failing that, though, I think the intent is clear that if there is no other option, to use some kind of force. How that would actually play out, I don't pretend to know. A lot would depend on whether talking, 5 years, 10 years, 15 years from now. Obviously, as the further in the future, the greater the capability, therefore the greater the options. But I think it's fair to assume that the intent is to use that capability as a last resort.
Okay. Anybody? Okay, back there. Oh, it's Michael.
Okay.
Mike Fonte. I'm a consultant who works a lot with the DPP in Taiwan. Thanks, Vincent, for your presentation. I wonder if you could tease it out a little bit. I am cautiously optimistic in this sense that I think that, of course, I lean towards Frank Scheck's, he's DPP, but he has talked significantly about trying to heal some of the splits in the country. And it would seem to me that an optimistic scenario with a lot of caveats is that if he should win, that would strengthen Mr. Wang Jinping's hand, and perhaps coalition building could take place between the lighter blues and the greens. I wonder if you would comment on that.
It's hypothetical, right? So you probably know more about the personal relationship between Frank Xie and Wang Jinping than I do. I think that personal affinity probably helps some, but the issue fundamentally, it seems to me, is partisan. So unless the leaders of the Pan Blue and Pan Green can see beyond their immediate differences and think for the best interests of the country, it doesn't matter who is in the presidential office. I think they can work this out. But if they have no political will, then even good friends cannot work this out, because if they are narrow-minded, they will be driven by immediate electoral gains. So I'm not endorsing any candidate.
We at the Wilson Center are not allowed to make political judgments, but I will make one observation. Politicians in Taiwan, seeing their narrow-minded immediate political interests, how unlike here. What a shock. Obviously, they have an immature democracy. Sorry. Yeah.
On the lighter side, can I suggest something to Shirley on the dangers that she had up there? And I want to thank the panel for a very wonderful, interesting discussion that perhaps you could include in this wonderful evolving democracy that was just mentioned, the food fights that go on in the legislature when they throw papers at each other and sometimes fists and things of that nature. And you see in the Taiwanese parliament, and you also see in the Japanese diet from time to time.
South Korean, too.
And South Korean, too, yes. And is that possibly a
threat?
Asian
It's very un-Chinese because they throw paper instead of food. But oh, you can't waste food. That's right.
Shirley.
It wasn't a question.
Oh, it wasn't a question?
No, just a comment.
Oh, just a comment. Okay. All right. We're in the commentary phase. All right. Right here. See?
Hi, this is Terry Wu from the Epoch Times. I have a question mainly to Mr. Wang. You mentioned that right now national security, it seems like party confrontation, partisan issues has taken higher priority than national security. And I have watched TV programs in Taiwan during the time when there was Daobian, anti-Bian movement. Mr. Shi's army was called Red Army, and the music played was actually what the Chinese Communist Party created a song against Chiang Kai-shek in the early years. So even the lyrics weren't changed. My question is, obviously it's to Chinese Communist Party's interest that, like you said at the beginning, that Taiwan and U.S. relations are sour. And we've seen this, probably wake signs during the election time as well. So what is the influence of Chinese Communist Party leadership in Taiwan? And does that contribute to the issue that it seems like the parties hate each other more than they would like to protect Taiwan?
Well, I think the answer to your question probably depends on who you ask. To some most partisan Greens, they will probably say that some of the blues look like, or behave like the agents for the Chinese Communist Party. One thing that does bother me is that in a democracy, I think that even parties from different sides of the aisle should be able to discuss, debate with each other. But in the case of Taiwan, you have, I think that both parties have a tendency of sort of going overseas, including the mainland, to criticize the other party, which I don't think is a very good way of empowering your own party or your opponent party. I think this actually plays into the hands of the Chinese communists.
Okay. Oh, yeah, back there. See.
Hi, I'm Winnie Chen from Voice of America. My question is mainly actually for Ms. Shirley Khan. This is something related also to today's topic. Last Friday, the Congressional Quarterly Report talking about the top Pentagon officials are trying to reverse the One China policy, especially during Rumsfeld. He would dispatch someone to Taiwan every week and try to tell the Taiwanese official that they are pro-independence, that independence is a good thing. But on the other hand, then the then Secretary Powell will send another person afterwards, try to disabuse what the Taiwanese officials were told. So what's your take on that report? And also, do you really agree that there is a very big disagreement between DOD and the State Department regarding the policies toward Taiwan? Thank you.
I was going to bring up my last slide, which was actually quoting Rumsfeld, and but hopefully you'll remember it. But it's too hard for me to get it. If you look at that, does that read to you like Rumsfeld was trying to really pressure Taiwan and he's really trying to get them to do something? I mean, to me, and the context of it was he's basically giving a hands-off approach. If you look at this last slide, the quote that I had up from Rumsfeld was a hands-off approach. He's basically saying we've done what we need to do as far as the U.S. obligation in TRA. The rest is up to Taiwan. And I think the article that you are citing is really quite simplistic. And that's all I'm going to say. Defer to someone else here.
Someone who was actually interviewed.
So there's someone in the
I really
audience
think it was an overly simplistic article and very biased.